Hi, welcome to lesson 4.10, the Second Great Awakening. The lesson objective is pretty straightforward. You are to explain the causes of the Second Great Awakening. Keep in mind, whenever you see a causation question, know that you should also be able to discuss some of the effects as well. There is just one single key concept for this lesson. You are to explain how the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs and a response to rationalism and changes to society caused by the market revolution leads to this Second Great Awakening. So the whole objective is straight up causation. But before we get into the Second Great Awakening, let's rewind. Earlier, if you remember, prior to the Revolutionary War, there was the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening takes place prior to the Revolutionary War. So it takes place in the first half of the 18th century. It is because of the anti-religious sentiment of the Enlightenment that this First Great Awakening takes place. Remember, the Enlightenment was all about rationalism, and there was a transition from God to God. There was a transition from religion to commerce as the central focus. So the First Great Awakening reinforces the belief that people need to attend organized church services to prove that God has chosen you for salvation after you die. So it's a heavy focus on organized church services. We move on to period 4, where we get into what is called the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a return to people of embracing religion in the United States. It occurs in the early part of the 1800s, 1830s, 1840s. Unlike the First Great Awakening, individuals in the Second Great Awakening find salvation by making the individual choice to accept God into their lives and by their actions as Christians. What actions would you take as a Christian? You would read the Bible, you would follow the teachings of the Bible. So note that there is a heavy emphasis on the individual idea of choosing salvation. So let's get into the lesson objective. What were the causes? There were a number of reasons that the Second Great Awakening takes place when it does. Keep in mind, you have to look at things in context. First reason, politically, we have this idea of Jacksonian democracy. With the rise of the common man among the working class and poor farmers, the idea of an individual person having political power through voting simply transfers itself to religion, where you as an individual could have power over your own personal salvation as well. So there's a heavier focus on the individual as a common person being able to vote, being able to be saved. The second reason is the market revolution, that great economic change that occurs in this time period. With new methods of production and the economic boom that it creates, significant changes occur in the United States, as we saw when we talked about cultural changes. But what we begin to see, as we said, there is a new middle class. We have skilled artisans becoming factory workers. So they lose a little bit of that individuality. We see the rise of the middle class. We see cities becoming larger. And when they become larger, they become more dangerous. They become overcrowded. We see the rise of immigrants bringing different cultures and different religions to the United States. So fear and comfort. The changes brought by the market revolution are upsetting. They're threatening to people who want to maintain the status quo. These people turned to religion as a source of comfort. So the fear of the unknown prompts them to seek comfort in the traditional religions or in religion in general. Second part of the market revolution, this new religions and religious ideas. As new immigrants from Europe bring new religions, such as baptism and Methodism, there's new religious ideas, such as millennialism. Millennialism predicts that the biblical end of the world is going to happen in about the year 1900. And to the United States, this was super appealing to Americans, especially Americans who were dissatisfied with the traditional religions such as the Puritan faith and Anglicanism, which is the Church of England. So fear and comfort brought by the market revolution and new religions and religious ideas push people to embrace this second great awakening. The third part is this greater social and geographical mobility brought in part by the market revolution. And the American system, the building of roads and canals, makes it easier to travel. You can move between classes, social classes. You can move between states. You can cross rivers. You can cross mountains. And since Western communities often did not have formal established churches and families were spaced far apart, you might have a homestead of several miles, your closest neighbor would be miles away. The Second Great Awakening ministers were called circuit riders. They would travel by horseback from town to town, thus bringing the same ideas of religion with them. They would not have an established church where you would go every Sunday. They might be in your area for a few weeks to a month, and then they would move on to the next. When the circuit riders were in town, there would be a revival. A revival is a religious gathering typically held in a large tent. It might be off on the edge of town, in a field, or next to the forest, that would be held for at least a week at a time. At the revival, circuit rider would preach a super fiery and emotional evangelical sermon, often against otherworldly sins such as alcohol, dancing, and gambling. These vices, these sins would distract individuals from finding their path to salvation. So the revivals were well attended, and they mixed all groups of people, upper class, lower class, women, men, children, because if you had kids, you wouldn't leave them at home. You'd bring them to the revival. So once you went to this revival, it would be said that you are born again. What born again means is it's a term for accepting personal responsibility for your salvation by accepting God into your life. You would have to testify in front of others, and often this was very, very emotional. You would be overcome with emotion. And when you were overcome with emotion, it was a sign that you had received the Holy Spirit into your life. So revivals were not like your traditional church of kneeling and praying. They were very emotional. They were more of an entire town event, and they were quite popular along the western frontier, meaning like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio was still considered the western frontier at this time. And last, the spread of the Second Great Awakening. Because you have these circuit riders, because you have these revivals, they're all traveling along the same roads. It begins in upstate New York, in a region known as the Burned Over District, because they were so burned with the zeal of the Lord that their souls were on fire. It starts in upstate New York, but soon it begins to spread throughout the South and the West, because these ministers, these itinerants, these circuit riders take the word of the God with them, and they spread religious fervor. They spread religious fire, and soon it encompasses and encapsulates the entire United States of America with these new religions. So if you look at learning objective, I do hope by now you are able to explain the causes, what led to the rise of this event known as the Second Great Awakening.